We've taken a look at ancient astronomers. Let's take a look at NASA. What are we doing now? Just as a reminder, we are not done with school yet. You guys are not done with school yet. I know we want to be, it's a little bit longer. Gonna need you to push through. Let's actually go back to before NASA. 1945, World War II just ended. There's this guy, this Nazi, named Wernher von Braun, the smartest rocket scientist on the planet. He actually developed the V2 rocket, which the Nazis would actually launch from France across the English Channel into London, and these gave regular citizens post-traumatic stress disorder because they'd fly through in the middle of the night. You would never know when they were coming. You might have a rocket with a bomb on top dropped on your head tonight, or maybe you won't. Maybe it's going to be the next block over. Maybe you'll survive, but your kids won't, or vice versa. The Nazis couldn't really control these rockets and where they went, so they couldn't aim them at like military facilities. They usually just dropped on neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, killed kids, very much non-combatants. This was Wernher von Braun. And right after the war, the United States, through Operation Paperclip, was like, we need to go get that guy. Yes, he's a Nazi, but if we don't get him, Russia's going to get him. And we don't want Russia to have him. So we went in and basically scooped him up and brought him back. And we said to him, listen, we know that you're a Nazi. You deserve all the bad things that you could possibly get. But if you help us, we're just going to kind of turn the other cheek and pretend that you were not a Nazi. So he started the rocket program in the United States. In 1946, we were launching our own V2 rockets, not at London, but just out in the desert in a test facility. But we were starting to figure out how to make rockets all the way back in 1946 because we had a Nazi working for us. And this Nazi-led program was the beginning of the United States space program. 10, 11 years go by. The United States and Russia are in the midst of a Cold War. You guys, I'm sure, have heard about all the spy movies between us and Russia. The KGB versus the CIA, Washington versus the Kremlin, duck and cover because of nuclear bombs. There's an arms race where both the United States and Russia, the two world superpowers, are building tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, enough for mutually assured destruction where every single human on the planet would get wiped out if there was a nuclear war. This is just a few years before the Cuban Missile Crisis with John F. Kennedy, where we were that close to having a nuclear war between us and Russia. This Cold War thing is starting to get a little bit tense. As we're building all these nuclear weapons, we're also trying to figure out how to shoot them at the other country. There happens to be a Pacific Ocean between us and Russia. Not only do we need a rocket that can go across an ocean, but we're also trying to spy on the other country. And we have what are called U-2 planes. I know you guys think it's a band, but the band was actually named themselves after a spy plane. It's one of those planes that fly at 100,000 feet, 3 times higher than like a 747. And take pictures. Every once in a while, those get shot down. And in 1960, one of them actually was shot down over Russia. And it was this huge debacle, leading to even more tensions. Anyways, we wanted a way to spy on Russia without having to put American pilots in danger. This was long before drones existed. So we wanted to make a satellite. We wanted to get something into space. Not only because it would help us with spying, not only because it would kind of tell us if our rockets were feasible, but it also would be kind of like, hey, we're better than you. On the world stage, the United States and Russia were always trying to one-up each other. If we can get something into space first, the United States looks technologically superior, we look stronger, we look more advanced, we look like the better country. So we are doing everything that we can to try to get a satellite into space. And right when we're about to launch, newspapers across the world print the headline, Russia launches first satellite into space. Sputnik 1, back in 1957, was the first man-made object to ever orbit planet Earth. We were so close. We launched ours, Explorer 1, a few months later, but Russia was first. And we're going to come back to that. Russia is first in almost everything. Russia beat us into space. Russia looked more advanced. Russia won. And this is what Sputnik sounded like as it was orbiting Earth, sending radio signals back to Moscow. So we had been very fairly beaten. We were not first. Russia beat us into space. And up until then, rocketry, obviously you're shooting things into the air, had been under the Air Force. And the Air Force, for a very long time, was under the Army. We figured that the Air Force kind of was not space. So we needed our own part of the government to be in charge of getting things up into space. So that's when we formed NASA. And they were tasked with getting us into space faster than Russia. So let's actually take a look at where NASA originated. NASA actually formed back in World War I. In 1915 was the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA. It was basically part of the Army that flew airplanes, which the Army didn't need as much anymore because we now had the Air Force. And we decided to let's just move that entire branch of the government, rename it, and make it in charge of getting into space. So the NACA turned into NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA. So October 1, 1958, we now have a space agency. And today there's 15 to 20 different NASA centers around the country. We have our Kennedy Space Center, which is where everything is launched from. And Johnson Space Center in Houston, that's where, once you're up in space, that's who you're talking to. Here's the test facility where they tested all of the rockets. JPL, which is basically the brain center for all of our learning missions, so like Juno around Jupiter or New Horizons going out to Pluto. When they're sending back all of their data and all of their findings, they send it back to JPL. NASA headquarters is in Washington, D.C. A lot of these other places are where engineers work, where they are designing different parts of a rocket. And I want you to notice, almost all of them are on the coast. Why would they be on the coast? They're on the coast for a number of reasons. First, they're going to require a ton of materials. And what better way to get things to them quickly than by ship? So when these were built in the 50s and 60s, the fastest way to get a ton of really heavy materials to places was by water. Can you do it across land? Yes, but it's more expensive, it takes longer, and a lot of these places are going to be dealing with chemicals or fuel, things that traveling across land could actually be dangerous. Traveling through the ocean, if a ship blows up, it's not quite as catastrophic as if it blew up in downtown St. Louis. Kennedy Space Center is right on the coast, and the reason that they wanted to launch directly over water is because if something is launching and it goes wrong, you don't want it falling on people. So having the launch pad right next to the ocean is a must. Once upon a time, we could actually take field trips over to Kennedy Space Center. That has kind of been quashed. Field trips are not really allowed anymore, but if you've ever been or you ever get to go to Kennedy Space Center, it's a ton of fun. It's really cool. Highly recommended. The whole goal is to get humans into space, right? Russia beat us up into space with Sputnik, the first man-made object. Now we're going to see if we can send anything that is living up there. We have to beat Russia with this. We have to. They beat us with the first satellite. Let's beat them by sending something living and bringing it back. So, of course, Russia beats us again. This is Leica, who was a mutt wandering around Moscow. And she was probably going to be put down, so they grabbed her and said, why don't we use this dog that would be killed anyways? A few months after Sputnik 1 was Sputnik 2, and they put Leica into Sputnik 2. And so they launched this poor little puppy dog up into space, who was probably guaranteed terrified. And they had little sensors all over her to sensor how things were going. They honestly didn't know if she'd be able to survive the G-forces, if she'd be able to survive weightlessness. They didn't know about pressure. They didn't know about temperature, radiation. They just wanted to see what happens. They put sensors all over her. They got her up into space. She orbited a few times for a few hours. She just overheated. The cabin got to be 150, 200 degrees, and she was basically slowly cooked alive. Probably scared to death, probably crying. This slide always makes me sad. Leica did not make it. In the United States, 2 years later, it was like, now it's our turn. We were beaten, but we still need to see if we can send anything living. We didn't send a dog. We sent 2 little squirrel monkeys, Miss Abel and Miss Baker, A and B. We sent them up, and they came down, and they were actually alive. So while Russia did send a living thing into space first, I guess we are the first to bring a living thing back from space. So Miss Abel and Miss Baker both survived. They were only in space for about 16 minutes, and they were weightless for about 9 minutes. And at that point, we really didn't know what weightlessness was going to do. Would it cause the blood to not flow through your eyes correctly and you would go blind? Would it not allow your heart to pump correctly and you would start to die? Could you breathe normally? Could you move and function normally? Would blood be going to your brain enough where you don't pass out? We had no clue, but Miss Abel and Miss Baker came back. They survived. So we knew that being weightless was not going to kill you. But we didn't know whether or not you could still function. So after Miss Abel and Miss Baker came back, we sent Ham. Ham was a chimp. And what they did is they trained Ham to press different buttons. And if he pressed the red button, he got a treat. If he pulled a lever, he got another treat. If he pressed that button, he got a treat. They basically trained him to solve different little puzzles so that he could get a treat. They wanted to know whether or not going into space would cause your mental faculties, your brain function to decrease. Did you lose consciousness? Were you able to function? So they trained Ham to do basic tasks while up in space. Ham went up, pressed all of the buttons and pulled all of the levers and got all of the treats and came back down. And sure enough, you can function being up in space while you're weightless. So Miss Abel and Miss Baker came back, the first living things to come back from space. Finally, the United States had some sort of little win over Russia. And so they went on like a national tour. They were on TV shows, they had parades, they were pretty famous. You have to remember back in the 50s, nobody had ever been to space. It was brand new. The entire country was interested in it. You know, it was Flash Gordon comic books. And so seeing these 2 little monkeys that had been to space and come back and were just fine was actually kind of a big deal to a lot of people. I just think it's adorable. So we can send things into space, bring them back alive. We sent Ham up and he was pushing buttons and pulling levers. So we figured out that going to space does not cause you to like pass out, doesn't decrease brain function. Let's try to send a human to space. Project Mercury. NASA was like, let's send people, humans, into space. October 7, 1958, our goal for Project Mercury was to have a human orbit around planet Earth. How well did we function? So, I mean, pulling a lever and pushing a button is not the same as like being able to do calculus. And then to also bring the astronaut home safely. That is the goal of Project Mercury. Send someone to space, see how they do, make sure they get home safe. Seems simple enough, right? And now we had to pick our astronauts. And there is all kinds of discussion at NASA over who should go into space. Should it be death row criminals in case they die? They're going to die anyways. Should it be like horse jockeys who are super, super tiny? Somebody actually came up with the idea. It's not very common anymore, but I'm sure you've seen videos of people at circuses who would like climb into a cannon and get shot across the fairgrounds and land in a big net. Why would you want to send circus performers? Well, if you can get shot out of a cannon, your body can obviously withstand enough G-forces to be alive during launch. So they had all of these different suggestions. And it came down to, if they died, they did not want it to be a civilian that died. So they decided it needed to be somebody in the military. It needed to be somebody in the military who could fly, obviously. It needed to be somebody in the military who was used to being at high altitude. It needed to be somebody in the military who could handle high G-forces. So basically they were looking at pilots. But they had no clue if these pilots were going to be alive. So they wanted the most daring, courageous pilots who were flying the most crazy airplanes that we could produce at the time. It came down to them looking at test pilots. And they put out a call for astronauts. And they had thousands of test pilots from all branches of the military. From the Navy, from the Marines, from the Army, obviously the Air Force. And they whittled from like 1,000 of the best test pilots down to 7. They put them through all kinds of tests. If you've ever seen the film The Right Stuff, which is an excellent film, I wish we had time to watch it. It's basically how they chose these test pilots and then turned them into astronauts. So we came up with 7 test pilots, and those 7 test pilots became known as the Mercury 7. They basically were the most famous people in America for quite a while. This is probably the most iconic, famous picture of them. They're all standing in their space suits, and they are as follows: Walter Schirra, Deke Slayton, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, and Gordon Cooper. We're going to see some of these names again. Deke Slayton, we're definitely going to see again. John Glenn, we're going to see him again. Gus Grissom, remember his name. Alan Shepard was probably the best of all of them as far as being a pilot. Remember some of those names because we're definitely coming back to them. We've got our astronauts. Let's train them up. Let's get them into space. Let's beat Russia. Russia beat us. Russia sent the first astronaut into space, Yuri Gagarin. He's as famous in Russia as Neil Armstrong is in the United States. Yuri Gagarin was the first human to ever go up into space and come back down. I can only imagine how scary it would be to be the first human to sit on top of a giant rocket, basically a bomb, shoot up into space where there's no pressure, and then try to come back down to Earth. He had to be pretty brave. His flight aboard Vostok, which was the name of his rocket, lasted about an hour and a half, which means he orbited just over once around planet Earth. So Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space, the first man to orbit planet Earth. April 12th, 1961. And less than a month later, Alan Shepard ends up in space. In fact, Alan Shepard was supposed to launch in March. Alan Shepard would have been the first human to ever be in space, but there was bad weather. And so they had to push the launch back. And because of the bad weather and pushing the launch back, Yuri Gagarin launched first. He's now the first person in space. Alan Shepard is now the first American in space, second human. And the thing is, Alan Shepard being the first American in space, he didn't even orbit Earth. He was only up there for less than an hour. And Gus Grissom, the second American in space, also wasn't up there long enough to orbit Earth. So the Russians were way ahead. They were up there first, and they orbited on their first try. It wasn't until our third try, when John Glenn orbited Earth, that we finally got a person to go all the way around. Here are the rockets that these guys were riding on top of. This little black capsule, that's where you were sitting as an astronaut. This little black capsule is where there's an astronaut. All of the rest of this is just rocket fuel. It's basically a giant bomb. These are the Mercury rockets. If you go out to the Space Center, there's actually one of the Mercury rockets randomly just sitting in, like, it's not a parking lot, but this isn't even at the Space Center. It's like on the side of the road on your way to the Space Center. But there is a Mercury rocket that you can actually go and stand next to and take pictures of before you get to the Space Center. All right, so Russia beat us into space, right? What can we beat Russia at? Well, Russia's still ahead. They were the first to send a woman into space. The United States did not send a woman into space until the mid-'80s. Sally Ride went up in, I think, like 82 or 83. So we're about 20 years behind Russia as far as sending a woman into space. And then I think the guy who is the bravest is this guy right here, Alexei Leonov. He's the first person to go up into space. This brand new technology, this brand new thing that we can do. He's up in space, he's orbiting around, he's looking out the window, he's weightless, there's no air. And he opens the door and gets out. He's the first person to do a spacewalk. I cannot even imagine what he was thinking as he's like going towards the handle. I've got air in here, I'm alive. What's going to happen when I open the door and get out and walk into space? Nobody's ever done this before. We have no clue if it'll work. We have no clue what will happen. I'll do it anyways. This guy right here, Alexei Leonov, is braver than I am. That's for darn sure. So Russia has the first satellite in space, sent the first animal to space, sent the first human to space, first to orbit Earth, first woman in space, first spacewalk. Is the United States going to be first in anything? What's even left to do? We are thoroughly being thrashed by Russia. The president, Kennedy, while he was speaking at Rice University, said this.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
And this is his famous vision of getting us to the moon before the decade is out. He has sat by and watched the United States be second to Russia for everything. Let's get somebody to the moon before they do. So he decides to just throw tons of money at NASA. Basically, 4% of the United States budget went to NASA during the 60s. Today, it's 0.5%. And that's for all of the science and the education and the research and the rockets and the sending astronauts up. 0.5%. 4% of the United States budget went towards getting somebody to the moon. Why? Is it really going to make our country that much better? No, we wanted to beat Russia. We're in the middle of the Cold War. Russia is beating us in everything. Russia looks stronger. They look more advanced. They're basically making us look foolish on a world stage. The only reason that we went to the moon is because of the Cold War. The only reason that we went to the moon is because we did not want to lose to Russia again. If Russia was not beating us in everything, most people think that we would not have gone to the moon. The whole goal was to beat Russia. With that said, the number of technologies that have come out of the space program is staggering. A ton of things like artificial limbs, scratch-resistant lenses, GPS, freeze-drying foods, LASIK surgery, solar cells, shock absorbers for buildings in earthquake zones, little handheld dustbuster vacuums, insulin pumps, firefighting equipment, invisible braces, LEDs. Basically, a lot of things that we use every single day came from the space program. So we went to the moon to try to beat Russia. We ended up getting quite a bit of technology that we use every single day out of the space program. So where do we go from here? Our president wanted us to go to the moon. What's next? We're going to go from Mercury to the Gemini program. Gemini is the constellation of twins. We know that to go to the moon, we can't just send one person. We need to send at least two, probably more. We also know that it's going to take a long time. So the Gemini program is not to prove that we can get into space. The Gemini program is to prove that we can survive in space, that we can be there for an extended period of time. So we sent up a couple practice runs, and then we had 10 missions where we sent up 2 astronauts each. And this entire program only lasted like a year and a half because it was a stepping stone towards getting to the moon. They would send up 2 astronauts who were in this capsule, and you can see how they're sitting down. You can see how there's virtually no room for them to move around. And they're like, why don't you stay up there for a few weeks? I don't know if you've ever been in a car ride, but after like 2 hours, I'm ready to get out of the car and stand up and stretch. These guys were basically in a car ride for 2 weeks, and they for sure could not get out to stand up and stretch. This is NASA learning how our bodies react to extended periods of time in space. Yeah, we can survive for short amounts of time, but can we live in space? Can we keep them alive with the right temperature, the right pressure, the right amount of air? How do we feed them? How do we get them enough water? And most importantly, how do they go to the bathroom? I don't know if you've ever been on a car trip and you tell your parents, hey, I have to go to the bathroom, like really bad. And they're like, okay, we're almost to the next exit. That's what most parents would say. Imagine being on the same car trip and saying, I have to go to the bathroom, and your parents just saying, here's a bag, just go. Oh, and your friend who's sitting in the seat right next to you he's just going to be there too. Oh, and you're floating, so don't miss. This is the Gemini program. You're going to recognize some of these names. So you have Gus Grissom, Walter Schirra, 2 of the Mercury 7. Neil Armstrong, maybe you recognize him. James Lovell, if you've ever seen Apollo 13, the movie, this is who Tom Hanks plays. John Young, you may have driven on his road before. He's from Orlando, so we named a road after him. So if you've ever driven on John Young Parkway, that's named after this guy. Buzz Aldrin, you may have heard of him as well. So the first group of astronauts were all Mercury 7 astronauts. They've been to space before. They're going to space again. We know you can survive for a short amount of time. Let's see how you do for a long period of time. And then the second group were the next group to go up. And then you have the third group. So this is just kind of chronological order of how they went up. while the United States government was giving a ton of money to NASA, it's not like that money was just being thrown away. It was being paid to people. And the number of jobs that were created by NASA, not only the astronauts, obviously, but the scientists, the researchers, and the engineers, but also the people who built all of the buildings for NASA, the people who cleaned those buildings, the people who worked in grocery stores next to those buildings, the teachers who taught those people's children. The number of jobs created by NASA was huge. Just during the 60s, almost 500,000 jobs were created that would have never existed if it was not for NASA. With all of these launches and testing being done down here in Florida over on the Space Coast, the entire Space Coast basically grew up in the 60s because of NASA. There was nothing there beforehand. So if you go over there, you have Titusville and Cocoa Beach and Merritt Island. It was like a ghost town in the 50s. In the 60s, it's now a pretty populous place with a ton of jobs. Orlando was also not that big of a city until the 60s, until the space program came. You have to remember, Disney did not cause Orlando to grow in population until the 70s. So Orlando basically grew because of the space program originally, and then because of some mouse who makes I-4 traffic really bad. Here's a couple pictures. So the VAB, which is the Vehicle Assembly Building. When it was built, it was the largest building in the world. Even now, it's still like the 4th largest building by volume in the world. And as tall as it is, this is considered to be one story because there's not floors that like go across it because you're putting rockets in there. And so there's no floors. So this is a one-story building. It's the tallest one-story building in the world. So how big is this? Well, this flag has a bunch of stripes on it. And each one of those stripes, you can drive an entire school bus down the stripe and have plenty of room on either side. The stars that are on this flag, I'm about 6 feet tall. I could lay down with my hands over my head and I would completely fit inside of one of those stars. So this is a huge, huge flag, and it doesn't really look that big compared to this building that it's on. Here's a water tower. You know how big those are. And it looks like a little toy next to this building because you build rockets in here. So you're building your rocket here, and then there is a long, 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 long little driveway down to the launch pad. Why is there such a long driveway? Well, if you put the launch pad right here and something goes horribly wrong and it blows up, well, now you just blow up your entire thing. So they want to get this pretty far away. Here is mission control, the people who are making sure that everything's going correctly, the guy who's going 10, 9, 8. They all are working right here in mission control. They're looking down at this launch pad down here. How do you get down that big long driveway? If you're a rocket, you're put onto the crawler. And this crawler is huge. I mean, look at how big this guy is. This is the original crawler. You have 4 tank treads. Each one of these treads has its own giant engine. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 engines to drive the 4 different tank treads. And even with 4 engines, it goes real slow. Why would you need to go slow? You're carrying a rocket and you don't want to tip the rocket over. The crawler is down here. You have the platform that the rocket was sitting on. And this is an Atlas V rocket being taken down to the launch pad to go to the moon. Here's launch control. You can see the VAB behind it, that building that I pointed out earlier. And you'll notice that there's a bunch of windows. And those windows are all aimed right at the launch pad. So as you're sitting in launch control, you can look out the window and see as the rocket is going up through the sky. Except that these windows are right here, and everybody in launch control is faced in the opposite direction. They're faced away from the windows. Why do you think you want everybody that's in launch control to face away from the windows? Well, because as soon as the thing blasts off and is going up, everyone's going to be watching it as it goes up. You want these people to be focused, paying attention. They have a job to do. They have people's lives are on the line. These guys need to concentrate and focus, but it's human nature as a rocket is blasting off to watch it. So they actually have them turn around so they can't look out the window on accident. And then once their job is done, because after about 10 to 15 seconds, control is actually transferred to Houston, even though it's still in Florida. Control is transferred to Houston, and these guys are done. So this is launch control, not mission control. And once their job is done, then they all turn around and they can watch the rocket go the rest of the way up into space. So we have launch control, where everybody's facing away. After about 10 to 15 seconds, once the launch has been successful, then the mission is underway. You transfer over to mission control. Mission control is in Houston. All right, so we have Mercury. We picked our astronauts. We went to see if we could put them up in space, bring them back alive. And then we had Gemini. We wanted to see if they could last for a while up in space. Apollo. This is the mission that's going to land us on the moon. It started in late 1966. And remember, Kennedy wanted to be on the moon before the end of the decade. So they had little over 3 years to figure out how to get to the moon. Kennedy was shot in 1963, so he was not even around to see this happen. But they were using Saturn V rockets, which are the biggest, strongest rockets to ever be produced until just a few years ago, with the Falcon Heavy rocket from SpaceX. And they had 12 manned missions and 6 unmanned practice missions just to make sure all the equipment was working. The Saturn V rocket, which was the biggest rocket to ever be produced, the exhaust nozzle is taller than a human, and there's 5 of them. This is basically like sitting on top of a nuclear bomb. This is extraordinarily powerful. This little section up here is where the people sat, the astronauts. This was all rocket fuel, that was all rocket fuel, and this was all rocket fuel. Why did you need so much rocket fuel? Well, you had to escape Earth's gravity well. So you have to have rocket fuel to lift up the astronauts. But you have to have rocket fuel to lift up the rocket fuel. And then you have to have more rocket fuel to lift up that rocket fuel, which is lifting up that rocket fuel. Basically, most of the weight of a rocket is fuel to lift the other fuel. So this many stories high rocket is really just lifting this little tiny module with people in it. And it's built in stages. Because once this is empty, it doesn't have any fuel, there's no reason to continue to carry that empty fuel tank. So drop it. And then once this drops away, this will light up and start going. And once this is empty, then this drops away and this lights up. And once this is empty, this drops away. And you just have a little tiny bit of fuel left in the module for course corrections to get you to the moon. So here are the different stages. Here's that bottom stage. And here's the second stage being set into that bottom stage. I want you to notice something. As huge as these are, this little tiny module up at the top is where all of the astronauts sat. Over here, Skylab, which we're going to get to in a second, this is the first space station. Skylab rode up into orbit on an Atlas V rocket. Instead of having a little module that has people in it, it had like a little cargo module. So it looks a little bit different because it had a little bit different mission. Here's where all of the astronauts sat. Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins are sitting right here. They might be waving. Probably not. Let's go through some of these missions. Apollo number 1. Let's get it started. Oh, crap. What happened? 1967. Virgil, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. I told you to remember Gus Grissom's name. That's him. Roger Chaffee, his middle initial is B. I actually know that because just like there's John Young Parkway in Orlando, Roger B. Chaffee Parkway is up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I grew up. So Roger Chaffee is actually from Grand Rapids and had a road named after him. And then Ed White was the commander. While they were on a training mission, they were in a capsule and they were simulating that mission. There was a fire. They couldn't get out, and they were all burned alive.
Today marks the 40th anniversary of the Apollo 1 fire. It was NASA's first tragedy, and it's the story we're going to go through in very brief detail today on Vintage Space. On January 27th of 1967, the Apollo 1 crew, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, was going through the plugs out test. This was a routine pre-launch test designed to put the spacecraft through a simulated countdown and launch using the spacecraft's own internal power systems. The plugs connecting it to the external power from the ground were out. The test was problematic from the start. Grissom smelled something like sour buttermilk in his oxygen feed, there were communications problems, and a high flow of oxygen triggered a master alarm. These delays all led to holds, but at 6:31 in the evening, the crew was finally ready to get back to the plugs out test. But at that moment, instrumentation from inside the spacecraft registered a spike in oxygen flow, and at the same time movement of one of the astronauts in their couches. 4 seconds later, the word fire was heard over the comm loop. Controllers in the White Room leapt into action in an attempt to free the crew, but the flames licking the side of the spacecraft made it impossible. The pressure inside the spacecraft built up until the hull ruptured, and flames poured into the White Room, sending some men fleeing. But even those who stayed couldn't free the crew. By the time they got the hatch open, all 3 men were dead. They had asphyxiated when smoke got into their oxygen system. The 8-man Apollo 204 review board, that was the mission's internal designation, was created just hours after the fire. The Spacecraft 12, was taken apart piece by piece alongside Spacecraft 14, an identical Block 1 model of the Apollo command module. The 2-month investigation revealed exposed and frayed wires and a possible corrosive fluid leak in the coolant system. A spark from any one of these wires could have started the fire, which would have become explosive in the test environment. The spacecraft was designed to be pressurized with 5 pounds per square inch of pure oxygen in space, but to simulate that pressure differential at sea level, the spacecraft was actually pressurized to 16.7 pounds per square inch of pure oxygen. Any kind of spark would have immediately turned into an explosion in that kind of environment. Sealing the crew's fate was the hatch design. It was designed to open inward, which meant that the crew, lying on their couches, would have had to reach above them and behind them to pull against the pressure rising inside the spacecraft. It was the same for the men on the outside in the White Room. No one could push against the pressure building up inside the spacecraft. After the fire, the hatch was redesigned, the plugs out test was reclassified as hazardous, and the spacecraft's environment was changed. During launch, it would be a mixed oxygen-nitrogen environment, and it would slowly bleed out to be replaced by pure oxygen for the rest of the flight. With the end of the decade fast approaching, NASA recovered extremely quickly. In October of 1968, the first manned Apollo mission, Apollo 7, flew a textbook flight demonstrating that the redesigned Block 2 Apollo spacecraft was indeed ready to fly to the moon.
Here's the command module before. Here's the command module after. And when you take off that outer panel, you can see just how hot the fire was. Because of the all-oxygen environment, the fire was extraordinarily hot. The launch pad that this was happening on was actually shut down, obviously, and has never been used since. This is the launch pad where the Apollo 1 tragedy happened, and they put a plaque up, they closed it, and it's never been used. It's a memorial. It's out next to all the other launch pads at Kennedy Space Center, but they've never used it. It's just been empty. It's known as Launch Complex 34, and after those 3 astronauts died, they decided that it was going to be a memorial to them, and it's never been used since. With that tragedy, that didn't mean that the space program was canceled. Obviously, going into space is very dangerous. That's why they started with using military servicemen, because they didn't want civilians to be put in that much danger. They knew that accidents could happen. They had volunteered for this. So the space program did not stop. They did suspend testing for a while they figured out what went wrong as quickly as possible, because they were still on a deadline. They redesigned the hatch. They changed how testing was going to happen. And then they did a bunch of practices. And it wasn't until Apollo 7 that they're like, all right, let's put a person back on. So Apollo 7 was the first time that humans got back into a module to get blasted off since Apollo 1 fire. We just wanted to see if everything worked. Went up into space and everything worked. Thank goodness. Apollo 8, this is the big one. This is the first time in human history that humans had ever left low Earth orbit, had ever gotten to space, left low Earth orbit, and traveled to the moon. They didn't land on it, but they traveled to the moon and orbited to see if we could. So this is kind of a practice to landing on the moon, seeing if we could get there, seeing if the navigation worked, seeing if everything went well. Apollo 8, humans traveled to the moon for the first time in history.
Borman, Lovell, and Anders will fly the most powerful rocket ever, the Saturn V. At 363 feet, it's the size of a 35-story office building and carries 1 million gallons of rocket fuel. No other rocket can launch a manned spaceship beyond the bounds of Earth orbit.
The night before the launch, Saturn V was out there with floodlights on it, and somebody had the bad taste of telling it was like a 2-kiloton nuclear explosion if it blew up, so we just hoped it wouldn't blow up.
This is Apollo Saturn launch control at 2 hours, 20 minutes and counting. Countdown still going very satisfactorily at this time.
I had decided that there was about a 1/3 chance that the flight would be totally successful. Then I thought there was a 1/3 chance that we wouldn't make it back.
The mission was more important than anybody. It was more important than our lives, than our families. That's what we were there for. We were killed more times in simulation than you can shake a stick at.
T-minus 90 seconds and counting.
It was very, very cold. We sat in there and shivered and froze.
50 seconds and counting. We have the power transfer. We're now on the flight batteries within the launch vehicle. 45 seconds.
You could see up a little bit. We were flat on our backs. And I recall that circling over the spacecraft were a couple of seagulls, and I've often wondered what happened to those seagulls. They must have been the most surprised birds in the world when that thing lit off.
T-minus 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Sideways shaking was unbelievable. The vibration was so intense you couldn't see the instrument panel. I thought we'd had it during the launch. I was hoping that Frank Borman didn't have his hand on the abort controller. He said he took his hand off and he'd rather die than make a false abort.
1 minute after liftoff, the Saturn V is already supersonic.
Well, the Saturn V is still the most powerful machine that man has ever devised. 20 tons of fuel a second, 7.5 million pounds of thrust. I think we were all surprised at how strong that thing was. It had had 2 or 3 iffy missions before ours, but it was a piece of cake. It just worked beautifully. Unbelievable.
5 engines in the first stage blast the Saturn V to 7 times the speed of sound.
The second stage cut in. Big bang.
At 40 miles high, it's still accelerating.
When you staged, you were thrown forward in the belts and then backward in the belts.
And I thought I was being catapulted through the instrument panel.
All sources show that the stage is burning perfectly.
The third stage fires twice. First, the boost into orbit. The second burn takes the crew of Apollo 8 where no men have ever been. Deep space.
There was no way that the Earth's gravity could hold us back any longer. So we were on our way.
Apollo 9, we went back up into space and they started practicing again. They were making sure that they could undock the lunar module and then redock to the command module, which is something that had to happen. Apollo 10, again, went all the way to the moon. It was kind of a dress rehearsal, a dry run. We weren't going to land. We wanted to see, though, if everything went perfectly. So they did every single thing that they needed to do to land on the moon, except for actually going down and landing on the moon. Because then Apollo 11, we got to land on the moon. You have Neil Armstrong, the commander, Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot, and then Michael Collins, who was the command module pilot. When Neil and Buzz went down to the moon, Michael Collins was all by himself orbiting the moon. He was the most isolated human being in the history of humanity because his 2 closest friends were on the other side of the moon and every other human alive was back on planet Earth. So Neil and Buzz at least had a little friend nearby. Michael Collins was as far away from another human as anybody has ever been. I often wonder if he was jealous. He's like, I'm so close. I'm so close and I don't get to go down and walk on the moon. But That's what he signed up for. He knew that well in advance that he wasn't going to get to walk on the moon, but he at least got to go to the moon, which I guess is kind of cool. But man, I really would have been like, want to trade? This is them walking out of the White Room where they got dressed, and they basically had people help them get their spacesuit on to travel up to the command module. This is them blasting off. So they're right up here in the command module. The photo of them, they're already almost up in space, and you can still see how huge this rocket looks. This is the lunar module right after it separates from the command module, headed down to the surface of the moon.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And then some super, super, super famous words that Neil Armstrong just said. And this is Neil Armstrong. This picture was taken by a camera mounted on the outside of one of the landing struts. This, however, is not Neil Armstrong. This is Buzz Aldrin, because otherwise who'd be taking this photo? So really, I think Neil Armstrong was just Buzz Aldrin's photographer. He just had to get up there first to set up the camera. Obviously, we're the United States, so we have to colonize everywhere we go. The moon's ours, suckers. America. A lot of people say it's fake because you don't see stars in the background. But if you've ever taken a photography class, the stars are so dim that they're just completely washed out by everything in the foreground. If you had a long exposure camera, this would be overexposed and be too bright to see, and you could see the stars in the background. So the fact that there's not stars here is not proof that this was fake. It's proof that people that say that don't know how photography works. And then they landed. They landed with a bunch of rocks from the moon. Normally you guys would get to hold, but not this year. And then they had to quarantine because they were the first to ever go down and walk around on the moon. And we did not know, we honestly did not know if there was like a virus, a moon virus. We didn't know if they were bringing back moon germs. And if so, no human in history had ever been exposed to that. And it could possibly wipe out humanity because nobody has any immunity. So they had to quarantine for 2 weeks. Welcome back to Earth. You just spent 2 weeks in a capsule. Now you get to quarantine in this little booth for 2 weeks. They got to meet the president who stood outside of this little quarantine trailer. And thank goodness there's no moon bugs, because after the quarantine was done, they found a hole in the floor and they weren't quarantined at all. They were, oops, 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 oops.
At 15 seconds, guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds forward, drift. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're going to be busy for a minute.
Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon. On this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful, Samuel. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here. Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation. Tranquility Base, Houston, guidance recommendation is pings, and you're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway. 7, 6, 5, engine arm ascent. Beautiful. Very smooth. Very quiet ride. Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over. Apollo 1, this is Apollo 11, reading you loud and clear. Our position 1330.
There is a photo of Neil Armstrong's boot print. I think I showed you that I have a little version of that. I have a little ceramic version of it. This is a plaque that's left on the lunar lander, so it's still up there because they did not bring the lunar lander back with them. They did leave the flag, however, and you can still see the landing site with the LRO, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. You can actually see the landing site of all of the lunar landers. So here's Apollo 12. You can see all of their little footprints where they got to run around. This is where they landed, and you can basically tell that somebody was running around on the surface of the moon. Apollo 13 didn't make it to the surface, but you can see Apollo 14's landing site, and you can see where they walked to. Those are the first three. The next one, Apollo 15, actually had a little moon rover, and you can see that there's little tire tracks on the surface of the moon. So 15, 16, and 17 all had rovers, little moon buggies, and you can actually see tire tracks. Even to this day, with no erosion, those tire tracks are still there. Let's go through the moon landing missions. Apollo 11 we just talked about. Most famous, obviously, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Michael Collins is kind of the forgotten guy, but he was on the mission for the first moon landing. Apollo 12 went up without a hitch. However, right after launch, they were struck by lightning. There was a very, very bad storm during launch, and as they were going through the clouds, boom, the rocket was struck with lightning.
Apollo 12 rather famously launched through bad weather on November 14, 1969. As the Saturn V tore through the electrically charged clouds, the rocket and its contrail acted like a lightning rod. The rocket was struck by lightning twice, and this had the effect of knocking out the spacecraft's main power systems. Or at least that's what it looked like in the display panel inside the spacecraft and the console boards in mission control. What had really happened was that the lightning disrupted the spacecraft and the rocket's electrical systems, enough that low power levels had upset the signal conditioning equipment, abbreviated SCE. This box of electronics served the obscure but vital role of translating information from sensors into the signals that fed the displays in both the spacecraft and in mission control. It was John Aaron, the ECOM on duty during launch, who recognized the failure. He famously made the call to the crew to turn their SCE switch into the aux position.
Striking something with enough fuel to rival a nuclear bomb with lightning is a little bit terrifying, but everything worked just fine. Apollo 13, lucky number 13. These gentlemen headed towards the moon. They got to the moon, but on the way, there was an explosion. They basically had to go from the command module, where they were supposed to live. All three of them had to go sit in the lunar module, which is what's supposed to land on the moon, because the command module was running out of air. They were now living in the little part that's supposed to go down to the moon, which is made for two people. So all three of them were living there the whole time that they were driving to the moon. They got to the moon, and obviously instead of going down and landing, they just circled right around and came back. And nobody really knew if they were going to be able to get back into Earth's atmosphere, because they had to shut everything down after the explosion. The guidance control systems didn't really work. They had to do a lot of navigating by hand and by stars. We didn't really know if they were going to get back. If you haven't seen Apollo 13, the movie, I'm not going to tell you whether they make it or not, because I don't want to give it away. Okay, they make it. But here's a photograph of the actual command module after they separated, right before they came back into Earth's atmosphere. They took a photo, and there was this giant explosion, which means they were only separated from the vacuum of space by a few very thin little sheets of metal. I have a quote on my classroom door: "Failure is not an option." And that was Gene Kranz who said that. And Gene Kranz was the mission director during Apollo 13. He was also the mission director during Challenger and during the Columbia shuttle disaster. So he had a lot of successes on his watch. He also had most of the failures on his watch. But Lovell, the guy who Tom Hanks plays, also went to the moon on Apollo 8. He went to the moon on Apollo 8, circled around, thinking, oh, I'll get to land on this in a little bit. And then went on Apollo 13, didn't get to land, circled around, and then he was actually scheduled to go back to the moon to kind of make up for it on Apollo 18. Apollo 18 never happened. Richard Nixon canceled it. Richard Nixon wanted to spend more money buying bombs for the Vietnam War than to go to space. It is what it is. So Lovell never actually got to land on the moon, even though he went to the moon twice and was scheduled to land on it twice. Apollo 14 is the first time we ever got color photos from the moon. Apollo 15 was the first time that they ever took a little moon buggy. In the past, the astronauts would just get out and kind of hop around. They couldn't get very far. And so they wanted, if they're going to the moon, they wanted to explore a little bit more. So they brought along a car. That car is still there. There was no reason to bring that car back with them. They just left it on the moon. And each time we went to the moon, the astronauts stayed on the moon for a longer period of time. Neil and Buzz were only outside for a couple hours. They were only on the surface for about a day. By Apollo 15, they stayed down on the surface for over 3 days and traveled over 17 miles in their little dune buggy. And Apollo 15, in my opinion, is the best space mission to ever happen.
Our students move on, but the spirit stays with them.
Not that I'm biased or anything. Apollo 16 was the only one that landed in the highlands. All the other landed in the Maria, those big, flat, open plains. That's going to be much safer, much flatter, much more wide open. If you're coming down and landing a rocket, you need to land perfectly flat. You want to land in the flattest, most wide open place that you can find. But the highlands are a completely different type of surface, different geology, different formation, and we wanted to know about them. We wanted to bring moon rocks back from the highlands. So we went to the highlands. Apollo 16, instead of landing in the relatively safe as landing on the moon can be, the relatively safe Maria, they were tasked with trying to land a moon lander in the highlands. And then the last moon landing, Apollo 17, this was not the last scheduled. There was supposed to be an Apollo 18. As I just mentioned, it was canceled by Nixon. So the last time humans have ever been on the surface of the moon was Apollo 17. This guy right here is Eugene Cernan. He is the one and only scientist to ever be on the surface of the moon. He is a geologist. He went up to try to find as many different regolith samples and as many different types of rock as he could find. So he's the one that brought this rock back, not the entire thing. He chipped off a little bit. He's the one who found that orange glass, the lava that came out of the interior of the moon billions of years ago. And he is the absolute last person who has ever walked on the moon. Maybe there'll be another one day, but as of now, for the last 50 years, this guy right here is the last moonwalker, unless you count Michael Jackson. Here's Apollo 17, all gassed up and ready to go. And after Apollo 17, the Apollo mission was canceled. The Apollo missions were very successful. We did get to the moon before the end of the decade. We beat the Russians. We're going to start to build space stations. Of course, the Russians had to beat us to it. They had Salyut, which was the first ever space station, and it lasted about 10 years. And then we had Skylab a few years later. Ours lasted for about 6 or 7 years, and then slowly they just fell back to Earth. These are in low Earth orbit, which means they're technically still running into a little bit of Earth's atmosphere. Very thin, only a few atoms here and there, but it's enough to slow them down. And when you slow something that is orbiting down, that orbit is going to decrease. And as that orbit decreases, it's getting closer to Earth, it's going to get more and more atmosphere to interact with, until eventually it slows down enough that it just falls back into Earth. We didn't have a way to boost them to a higher orbit once they had started falling. The International Space Station does, but these first space stations did not. We knew this was going to happen. It was planned. It was calculated. So there was not anybody on board when this happened. But these space stations in the 70s were the first time that humans would actually go up, spend extended times up in space. The mid-70s was also the end of the space race. Once we had made it to the moon before Russia, and Russia had beaten us in every other possible thing that you could think of, we were kind of like, all right, what else is there to do? There's nothing. They had Salyut, we had Skylab, we both had a space station. Turns out, science works a whole lot better when you cooperate. So we would actually kind of help each other, share technology. The Cold War isn't over, but the science department, that's the wrong word, but the space programs of these two countries, while the governments were still kind of butting heads, the space programs worked together. And I've heard astronauts say it's because once you get up into space and you see planet Earth as this giant planet that we all have to share, you can't see any political boundaries, you can't see cities, you can't see anything that's man-made. All you see is this giant planet that's nature floating all by itself in emptiness. You have to work together in order to make things work. So going up to space gives you a new perspective that you don't get staying on planet Earth. It gives you a perspective of you need to cooperate. So the space programs of the United States and Russia were really the only parts of those two countries that would ever work together. We actually got to Skylab using Apollo command modules. So we used the Saturn V rockets, we used the Apollo command modules, and instead of going all the way to the moon, we actually stopped off at the space station. We had those Atlas V rockets already in production before the Apollo mission was canceled, but it was extraordinarily expensive. And so we needed a better way to get back and forth to a space station. Richard Nixon wanted a shuttle. Shuttles can go back and forth, so you launch, go up to space, bring it back, reuse it, and that was the goal. Much cheaper. Richard Nixon okayed the space shuttle in 1972, the last year that we walked on the moon. And in 1978, we picked our first group of astronauts specifically for the space shuttle. Some of those astronauts were actually Apollo astronauts. So there was a lot of overlap. John Young, who went up in a couple Gemini missions, a couple Apollo missions, also went up on a couple space shuttle missions. And in fact, this is a photograph of the first ever space shuttle mission. And John Young was the pilot. So John Young is sitting right up here flying this space shuttle up into space. Columbia was the first, but it wasn't the only space shuttle. In fact, Enterprise was before Columbia. It was just a test shuttle. It was for astronauts to figure out how to fly it. It never flew. And then you have Columbia. The second ever shuttle was Challenger. It flew a couple times. We'll get to Challenger in a minute. Then Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. Atlantis is over at Kennedy Space Center. So if you go visit, you can actually go into they've got it in a giant exhibit hall, and you can look and get just a few feet away from the space shuttle Atlantis, which went up into space quite a few times. Here's a timeline of all of the different space shuttles. So Columbia was first, but it didn't make it to the end. We'll get there. Challenger was second, did not make it to the end. And then Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. Atlantis was actually the last space shuttle to come back. So it was the last shuttle to fly. And these three made it to the end of the space shuttle program. Why did the space shuttle program end? Well, look when they were built. How many cars do you see on the road right now that were built in 1982? Very few. And a car is so much simpler than a space shuttle. Doesn't have to deal with being in space. There's much less moving parts, much less expensive to fix. The reason that the space shuttle program was discontinued or stopped about 10 years ago was because the shuttles were so old that they were starting to fall apart. It just wasn't safe to send a 30-year-old space shuttle into space. We needed something new. The space shuttle itself actually didn't launch. It was attached to the solid rocket boosters, an external fuel tank. It had an internal fuel tank as well. When it launched, sitting on the launch pad, the big giant sound that you hear and the really bright light, that's actually the solid rocket boosters. So these on either side are basically solid rocket fuel that gets it off of the launch pad and up above much of our atmosphere. And solid rocket fuel you can't control. You can't slow it down. It just burns until it's gone. And it burns really fast until it's gone. They don't want to use this when they get up into space because they can't turn it off. They use it to get through most of our atmosphere, and then once it runs out, they actually just kind of jettison these solid rocket boosters. And you can actually see them. There's video of them just falling back into the ocean. Once that happens, then you get this external fuel tank. And this external tank is the same rocket fuel that the space shuttle itself has, but there's a lot more of it. So it uses this extra fuel to get the rest of the way up into space. Once it's in space and it doesn't need all of this extra thrust anymore, then this external tank will fall away, and it's just the space shuttle that's orbiting using the fuel in its internal fuel tank. So these fuel tanks that are on the outside are used just to get it up into space. Once it's up there, they've already all fallen away. As Columbia is launching, you see that it's this solid rocket boosters on either side that's doing the lifting. The space shuttle engines are turned on, but they're not nearly strong enough to get this thing off of a launch pad. Coming back into Earth, they actually glide like a glider. And some of them land in Florida, but not all of them do. It depends on the Earth's rotation when they start coming back in. So some of them might land in Texas, some of them might land in California. And if you land in California, your next launch is going to be from Kennedy Space Center here in Florida. You can't drive it. You can't drive it like an airplane. So instead, they had a specially designed 747 built just for NASA. You couldn't buy a ticket to ride as a passenger on this. This was just used to transport space shuttles. So if you landed in California, they'd send this airplane and they'd pick the shuttle up, set it on the airplane, and the airplane would fly it back to Florida. And this is Challenger getting a ride back to Florida, piggyback style from the 747. This is a photo taken from the space station of Discovery, and you can see that there is a giant cargo bay. Space shuttle missions could have two different, functions. You could use it as a delivery vehicle, like we're going to take Hubble up into space. And so you fold Hubble up and put it into this cargo bay. And when you get to space, you open that cargo bay up and take whatever you need out and set it in space. Then you close the cargo bay doors and you return to Earth. Or you could keep these cargo bay doors closed the entire time, and you can actually, as an astronaut, go in there and live. And if you have a scientific mission, you're not delivering anything to space, but you're doing a whole bunch of experiments. That's usually what they did. This gives you a whole lot more room to carry those experiments out, more room to move around. So if you're not carrying something into space, you leave those doors closed, and then you can use all of that space as kind of a scientific laboratory. I want you to real quick notice that on the first shuttle launch, all of the external fuel tanks and rocket boosters were painted white so that it matches the space shuttle. However, after a few launches, they realized that all of that extra paint weighed a ton, and weight is the most important thing when you're trying to get into space. So they decided, let's stop painting these things, and now we can fit a whole lot more in our space shuttle to take up to space because we're not carrying all of this paint up off the ground. So the very first couple missions, they actually painted these, and then they realized that was a dumb idea and they stopped. So the liquid fuel tanks are then always going to be this orange color. Here's the space shuttle getting latched onto the solid rocket boosters and that external fuel tank. This is in the VAB, the Vehicle Assembly Building, the same building that was used to put the Apollo rockets together. If you've ever gone onto an airplane and you turn right to go to your seat, if you look left, you can see the cockpit and you see there's 8 million buttons, and you wonder how pilots remember where all the buttons are. A space shuttle is that on steroids. The number of buttons and things that a space shuttle pilot needs to know and remember and be able to get to just by memory is incredible. This is why it takes years and years and years of training to become a space shuttle pilot. Also why they use Gemini and Apollo pilots to do the first couple space shuttle missions. They already had a lot of this stuff learned. Here's Atlantis being picked up. It was laying down when it was delivered back to the VAB, but it's been picked up by this giant crane so that it can get attached to the rocket boosters. And this is a shuttle on the crawler. You still have to go from the VAB down to the launch pad, but I want you to notice, this is a lot bigger. They made a new crawler. Between the 60s and the 70s with Apollo and the space shuttle program in the 90s and 2000s, they made an entirely new crawler. Instead of it being 2 stories tall, this new crawler is 5 or 6 stories tall. So it's the same concept, same idea. Each little tire track has its own engine, but it is much bigger. And here is the space shuttle next to an Apollo rocket. You can see that the Apollo, much bigger, a lot more jet fuel. This is what's going to be needed to get to the moon. This is just needed to get to the low Earth orbit. You don't need nearly as much rocket fuel to get to low Earth orbit. So you don't need this big of a rocket. And this is one of my favorite pictures. This is that driveway going from the VAB down to the launch pad. And they have river stones. Those are some of the hardest stones that you can get. If they made it out of concrete or cement, as that crawler went across, it would just tear it up. It would crack, it would break. Even though they use river stones, some of the hardest stones that you can find anywhere, you can tell exactly where those tire treads went. This, on this side, was just run over by the crawler carrying a space shuttle. And this is what those river stones look like before. That crawler with a space shuttle on top is incredibly heavy enough to completely disintegrate all of these river stones. They also redesigned the launch control. Computers are better, so they redesigned it. You can actually, at the Kennedy Space Center, go into like a recreation and see exactly what all of this would look like. Some of them are faced out that giant window so that they can watch the rocket as it goes up, but a lot of them are still kind of, somehow I was having a rough day. A lot of them are still pointed in the other direction, so they would have to turn around to see the rocket go up. Space shuttle program lasted for 30 years, from 1981 to 2011. It's just not safe to send a 30-year-old shuttle up into space anymore, so it was retired. They stopped launching space shuttles when you were pretty young, but if you ever got to see one, they're pretty incredible. This is Atlantis blasting off in 2009, and I want you to notice they're shooting a whole bunch of little sparks at the bottom of the nozzles, and all of a sudden, as it blasts off, you see all of this gas being just shot out. It's extraordinarily bright. The shuttle is launching into space, and you'll see immediately it rolls over onto its back and starts to go forward. Now, there's a couple things in this video that I want to go over with you guys. So you can see that it's not going straight up, it's actually kind of rolled over on its back, and it's going forward. The first thing that I want to point out is all of the sparks that are shot at the bottom of the space shuttle. And the reason is that you can see them right there. The engines have not been lit yet. However, fuel is falling out of those engines. They don't want a bunch of fuel to just build up on the launch pad, because then when the engines do turn on, that fuel is all going to just explode. So what they do is they shoot sparks at the bottom of the space shuttle in order to get rid of all of that excess fuel that may have leaked out. That way, once the engines turn on, there's no chance of them exploding. Let's move on, and you'll notice that they start shooting a bunch of water onto the launch pad. You can just see it right at the very end here. There's a bunch of water, and it's actually that water that is all of this, what looks like smoke. It's not smoke, it's actually water vapor. And the reason that they shoot a bunch of water onto the launch pad is not to cool it down, it's to make it quieter. These rocket engines are so powerful that the sound they produce can actually travel outwards and damage things nearby. If you've been out to Kennedy Space Center, you know it's near the ocean. It's actually in a protected wildlife refuge. And that sound would be so incredibly loud that it could harm animals, it could harm the environment. So they shoot water onto the launch pad as a sound suppression system. They're trying to make the sound quieter. So all of this that most people think is smoke from the rocket fuel is nothing more than water vapor, because there's so much water that is shot onto the launch pad, and then it's immediately hit by rocket fuel. It instantaneously vaporizes, and then it is just pushed out of the way by the downward thrust of the rocket fuel. This is a test of that water suppression system. There's obviously no rocket, there's no space shuttle on the launch pad right now. What they're doing is testing to make sure that the water, literally tens of thousands of gallons, can be shot onto the bottom of this launch pad in order to make the sound of the launch a little bit quieter. You can see how much water is shot onto the launch pad. Most of it during a launch will immediately be evaporated, and you'll see those big clouds of steam. However, whatever is not evaporated, they don't want to just be sitting on the launch pad. So you can see that it actually falls down under the launch pad. And there's a big trough underneath the launch pad that carries all of that water back to a big holding tank. And then they can reuse the exact same water for the next launch. Here's a good picture of that trough. So tens of thousands of gallons of water a minute are shot onto this launch pad. Whatever is not immediately flash boiled into steam falls down through the launch pad into this trough where it's carried away and reclaimed. So now the next time you see a launch, there's a few things that you can notice. You'll see sparks start to, if it could stop shaking, please. You'll see sparks start to shoot out here in a second. There they are. That's to get rid of any excess fuel. And then you'll see a bunch of water start to shoot. That water is not to cool it down. That water is actually to make it quieter. There's the water starting to turn into steam. And then once the gantry lets go, that water is flash vaporized and is shot out in each direction. So this big cloud of smoke is not smoke. It's water vapor. It's water. You'll also notice that in just a few seconds, after it clears the launch pad, it rolls over and turns onto its back. And the reason is that it needs to get into orbit. There it is, turning onto its back right there. If it did not turn onto its back and start moving forward, what would happen is it would go straight up into the air. Once the rockets turn off, it would come straight back down. But if it turns onto its back and it starts moving forward, as it climbs, it's going to get faster and faster in the forward direction. And if you remember Newton's canon, if you go fast enough, the Earth will kind of curve out from under you and you will go into orbit. So in order for a space shuttle to go into orbit, it can't go straight up. It has to go forward as it's going up. I'm going to play this for you one more time where you can hear a little bit better. I want you to notice how quickly control goes from launch control to mission control. Launch control is in Florida. Mission control is in Houston.
Firing chain is armed. Sound suppression water system activated. T-minus
We're going to
10,
see the sparks.
9,
Soon we're going to
8,
start to
7,
see steam from
6,
all of the water shooting.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff of Space Shuttle.
And I want you to focus how quickly control is transferred to Houston.
The International Space Station.
Houston now controlling. Atlantis begins its penultimate journey to shore up the International Space Station.
That was about 5 seconds after launch. Some facts about the space shuttle. From 1981 to 2011, in 30 years, 135 shuttle flights happened. Sally Ride was the first American woman to ever go into space in 1983, 20 years after the Russians did it. John Glenn, one of the Mercury 7, one of the very first astronauts, in fact, the first American to orbit around Earth on our third launch. He's also become the oldest person in space. He, after becoming an astronaut and after retiring, actually became a senator. And after he retired from being a senator, he went back to NASA and, kind of as a publicity stunt, went up on a space shuttle. So when he was 77 years old, he got to go up into space again. Here you can see those sparks getting rid of any excess fuel on the launch pad. You can definitely tell that in this one, as soon as the rocket goes up, it starts to roll over onto its back and it starts to go forward. In this one, you can see that these solid rocket boosters, once it has gotten the space shuttle up to an upper level of their atmosphere, these rocket boosters are just about empty. You don't want to wait till they're all the way empty, because if they run out at different times, one of them will just push it over. So right before they run out, you let go of these solid rocket boosters, and now you have this external fuel tank, which is feeding the space shuttle's engines. These solid rocket boosters just fall back down into the ocean, and NASA goes and picks them up. When you land, space shuttles do not have brakes strong enough to get something that is that heavy and going that fast to stop. So there has to be a parachute that comes out, kind of like a drag racing car. You have to have a parachute because brakes are going to overheat and melt trying to stop something that is going that fast. And then we get to Challenger. Challenger, there was actually an elementary school where I grew up that was named Challenger. It was built a year or two after the Challenger exploded. The reason that they named this elementary school after Challenger is that Krista McAuliffe was actually a elementary school teacher, and she was going to be the first teacher to go up into space, and she was going to hold lessons where kids from across the country could tune in and be taught by a teacher up in space. What ended up happening is that the temperature was extraordinarily cold on launch day, cold enough that a lot of engineers wanted them to postpone. It had already been postponed a few times, and the higher-ups at NASA said, no, we need to launch. Because it was so cold, there were these big rubber gaskets. They're called O-rings. And basically, where the rocket fuel was being held in these external fuel tanks, these gaskets kept that fuel from leaking out. But when you get down to a low enough temperature, rubber becomes very hard and brittle, and it does not seal anymore. And so the temperature dropped, these O-rings froze, and they did not make a good enough seal. And rocket fuel started leaking out the side of the fuel tank. All it takes is one little spark from this giant engine a few feet away, and all of that rocket fuel is going to ignite, and it's going to explode. All 7 astronauts died, but we don't know when they died. There's some evidence that after the explosion, they may have still been alive, because when they went and recovered the space shuttle, it had been put into landing mode. So when you launch, you're not trying to use the joystick to drive it like you would when you're coming back in to land on a runway. However, after the fuel tank exploded and Challenger just was blasted away, somebody had put the space shuttle, somebody was trying to fly it. And you can only obviously do that if you're alive. So we lost communication, obviously. We don't know if they died instantaneously, but there's some evidence that maybe they were alive, and this happened a couple miles up. So it took them a few minutes for the space shuttle to fall down and hit the ocean. So they may have been alive as they were falling for a few minutes before they hit the ocean. And at that height, hitting the ocean is the same as hitting the ground. So to me, it's horrifying to think that there were possibly 7 astronauts trying to regain control of this space shuttle, knowing that if they don't, they're going to die. And they had a few minutes to try and do it, and they didn't get it done. All 7 of them died. Here's a photo of them walking out of the White Room. They are headed over to the gantry to go up and get into the space shuttle the morning that they launched. You can see that on launch morning, there was a ton of ice. It was very, very cold. One of the coldest days in memory for Florida. The first couple minutes of the launch went fine. The launch happened. It cleared the launch tower, and it looked as though things were going well. But if you look close, you can see that there's a little area where rocket fuel is leaking out of this external fuel tank. And at this point, this rocket fuel had already been ignited, and this flame went into the fuel tank and exploded the entire thing. And this is what it looked like after the explosion. They were able to recover a lot of the shuttle.
We're very excited about exploration and about space and about sharing it with everyone. The smiles on their faces and the extreme joy, they were really happy to be doing what they were doing.
And we're at T-minus 9 minutes and counting.
People thought that because the teacher would be on board that it might rejuvenate attention, but it did not.
T-minus 7 minutes and counting.
There weren't that many members here of the press.
Pilot Mike Smith has given an...
The mission has already been postponed several times due to mechanical problems and bad weather. Throughout the morning, engineers expressed concern about the unusually low temperatures. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger is cleared for launch.
Ground launch sequencer program has been initiated.
I remember I looked in their eyes and I wished them well on the journey.
T-minus 2 minutes and 20 seconds.
Krista's parents are at the Cape for the launch.
Sound suppression system now armed.
I've done a lot of launches on the top of the launch control roof out here, and I've seen families. They're worried, they're scared, they're in tears. That's not nice.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff.
We heard ignition, we heard liftoff. I heard the Call throttled down. Everything was looking normal. I was watching the main engines.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
You're sitting there quietly rooting for them. You're sitting there quietly saying, go Challenger, go Challenger.
Challenger now heading down range. Preparing to rethrottle the engines back up to 100%.
It seemed to be just kind of crawling in space.
One for the Guinness Book of Records with the size flight crew aboard. Go and throttle up. 3,305. Flight Fido. Go ahead. RSO reports vehicle exploded. Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation.
Seconds later, I happened to see sort of a flicker over on the TV.
Flight GC, we've had negative contact, lost downlink. Okay, all operators, watch your data carefully.
And I looked over, and I saw this picture of this expanding fireball with pieces moving in all directions.
The crippled rocket boosters careen out of control. Specially declassified footage shows them being remotely destroyed.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. We're working with it. Flight director confirms that. Okay. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
I knew instantly that none of them could possibly survive because we didn't have parachutes, we didn't have pressure suits, and at the altitude that they broke up at, there was no way they were going to maintain consciousness. It was immediately obvious to me that we had lost the entire crew.
It didn't look normal. And I knew that from the amount of training that we had had and from the launch that we had seen previous that Kristen and I had witnessed.
We are now looking at all the...
Very, very sad time. I felt horrible. It was a huge loss, and it always will be.
I believe every person in mission control came to grips with his demons that day. And I think several of us said a few prayers for the crew. And we also prayed for the team in mission control, the team in launch control, and those people would have to live with the aftermath of this accident.
Don't reconfigure your console. Make hard copies of all your displays. Make sure you protect any data source you have.
I was Vice President of the United States way back then. I went down there when Challenger blew up. It was a terrible tragedy, of course. So Reagan asked me to go down to comfort the families. It was a very moving thing for me to see these families in grief. I think the thing that really moved me was President Reagan's comments after that.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
They stopped all shuttle flights. They did an investigation. They found out what went wrong. They fixed the O-rings, but they also changed how NASA decided if you should launch. So it was a bunch of NASA higher-ups sitting in Washington saying, we have to do this. And there were engineers in Florida saying, no, it's too cold. Something bad's going to happen. The fact that those engineers in Florida who knew that something bad was going to happen were completely ignored and overruled, NASA changed its structure so that bosses couldn't do that anymore. There is a wonderful documentary on Netflix called Challenger. Don't often cry at documentaries, but it was very sad. I think there's 4 episodes. It goes through who the astronauts were. It goes through what went wrong. It goes through the decision-making process to launch. It goes through the aftermath. It's tough to watch, to be honest. If you watch one documentary this year, you should watch that one. The shuttles were grounded for about 2 years, until 1988. I can imagine how nervous the astronauts in the next launch would have been, knowing that the last time this happened, it blew up. But the next shuttle launch went off, and it was perfect. Everything went perfectly smooth, no problems. That was in 1988, and everything continued to go smooth for about 15 years or so. And then in 2003, Columbia happened. Columbia actually launched and got up into space and spent weeks in space doing science experiments and talking to mission control, and everything was going well. Everything was perfect. Then when it was time to come back home, they broke up on re-entry. What happened with this one is during launch, a piece of ice fell off the fuel tank and hit the wing and knocked off a piece of insulation. When you come back in to Earth's atmosphere, the friction heats up the bottom of a spacecraft to thousands of degrees. And you have to have very special insulation to not burn up. Well, a piece of that insulation was broken off, and so superheated plasma got into the wing and melted the wing. And once the wing melted and bent, the whole spaceship just started tumbling and broke apart. So here they are, headed over to the launch pad. They look incredibly happy, which is just heartbreaking. For a lot of them, it was their first time ever going into space, so they're pretty excited. The launch went great, no problems. They got up into space. They did an entire, 2-week mission up in space. And then as they were coming back into our atmosphere, they broke up. The space shuttle broke up. At least for them, we're 100% positive that they all died almost instantaneously. It was supposed to land in Florida, but it actually broke up over Texas. And pieces of the space shuttle actually landed in Texas, in Mississippi, in Louisiana, in Alabama. It basically covered about a 250-mile stretch where just pieces of this space shuttle were just falling. As far as we know, not a single piece landed on anybody. There was nobody that got hurt. Thank goodness. Otherwise, maybe more than just 7 astronauts could have died. And you can see that as it's breaking up, it's just getting torn into a lot of little tiny pieces. Each one of these glowing pieces is another chunk of debris that's going to fall onto the ground somewhere.
The fiery disintegration of Columbia ultimately led to the loss of lives and the retirement of NASA's shuttle fleet. But as it turns out, there's more to the story that makes it so much worse, because it didn't need to happen in the first place. Columbia's 28th trip into space had been delayed for 2 full years due to various issues, but when it finally lifted off on January 16, 2003, it took just 81 seconds for disaster to strike. That's when a piece of foam from the external fuel tank came off and damaged the shuttle's left wing. According to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, the foam chunk was about 2 feet long and a foot wide, and it hit the wing's heat-resistant panels at a relative speed of roughly 500 miles per hour. However, nobody at the time noticed. It wasn't until the following day that the foam strike was seen during a review of the launch. Foam striking the orbiter during liftoff had actually been a concern since even before the shuttle first flew in 1981. Following the first flight, over 300 heat-resistant panels had to be replaced due to damage from debris, and it wasn't an isolated incident. Most shuttle launches also had foam impacts. But the damage to the Columbia was different. Rather than hitting the more fragile white or black tiles, the foam struck the reinforced gray carbon tiles on the leading edge of the wing, which were thought to be more or less indestructible. So conventional wisdom said that a foam strike to those tiles couldn't possibly cause significant damage to the shuttle, an assumption that turned out to be deadly. A day after the launch, the foam strike was detected by NASA's Intercenter Photo Working Group. Immediately concerned that severe damage could have been done to the heat-resistant tiles there, Bob Page, the group's chair, quickly went to another official and asked him to contact the Department of Defense to obtain images of Columbia. 3 days later, a debris assessment team convened, and 2 members of that group also reportedly requested imaging of the left wing, believing the images would be crucial to assessing the damage. But they never got the images. According to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, NASA official Linda Ham blocked all 3 imaging requests, concluding that imaging wasn't required and that it would therefore waste too much time.
So the intent is to pack
each minute of the 24 hours that we're on orbit with science.
For her part, Ham would later claim to have no knowledge of the DAT's concerns. Whatever the case, though, the debris assessment team was left flying blind, and they weren't the only ones. Without images of Columbia's left wing, the debris assessment team had to rely on computer simulators to guess what might happen on re-entry. Their conclusion, the shuttle would suffer at least some heat damage on re-entry. They just didn't know how much. In the meantime, a week after launch, NASA finally clued the flight crew in to the fact that their shuttle was damaged, but they told crew commander Rick Husband and pilot William McCool that there was, quote, no concern. NASA told them they were only being informed of the foam strike so they wouldn't be taken by surprise if reporters asked them about it when they got back. On the morning of February 1, 2003, after 16 days in space, Columbia attempted re-entry. As detailed by the Columbia Accident Investigation Report, as the shuttle was streaking over California at 8:53 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, witnesses reported seeing several flashes of light. A minute later, 4 sensors in the shuttle's damaged left wing mysteriously went offline. Columbia shed a heat-resistant tile as it crossed from New Mexico into Texas at 8:58, and a final unintelligible communique came from the orbiter a minute later. According to ABC News, a report released by NASA in 2008 indicated that the first alarm to sound inside the shuttle would have come only 4 seconds before Columbia spun out of control. However, either Rick Husband or William McCool remained conscious for an additional 26 seconds, desperately attempting to save the crew. At 9 a.m., observers on the ground could see that Columbia was in pieces, and all 7 astronauts on board had been killed. NASA immediately launched an investigation, with the government mobilizing a massive effort to collect as much of the debris from the shuttle as possible to determine exactly what happened. While some unscrupulous people tried to profit off the tragedy by selling debris, most people turned over anything they found. By March, recovery efforts were centered on East Texas, where hundreds of pieces of the Columbia had been found. And then, unthinkably, tragedy struck again. While searching for debris on the afternoon of March 27th, a helicopter carrying 5 people suffered an engine failure near the Angelina National Forest in San Augustine County, Texas. Though 3 passengers survived, pilot Jules Francis Buzz Meyer and Texas Forest Service aviation specialist Charles Crinick were killed instantly. Crinick was awarded the Star of Texas in 2004, and a monument to the Columbia crew in Hemp Hill, Texas also includes a pillar inscribed with Meyer and Crinick's names. In the aftermath of the incident, investigators inevitably asked the million-dollar question: would it have been possible to save Columbia's crew? According to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, the answer was yes, if the damage to the left wing had been detected by either spacewalk or the requested imaging.
We availed ourselves of photographic techniques which were not used because it was not assessed as being so critical.
How? Well, the Space Shuttle Atlantis was already being prepared for its next launch. Originally scheduled to launch on March 1st, the launch could have been accomplished safely as early as February 10th. According to calculations, the Columbia crew had enough supplies to remain in orbit until February 15th, meaning the Atlantis could have flown a rescue mission. Once the 2 shuttles met, Columbia's crew could have spacewalked over to Atlantis for a safe return home. For the rescue scenario to have been possible, though, the damage to Columbia's left wing would have had to have been discovered by the 7th day of the mission, which it could have been if those requests for imaging hadn't been denied.
Again, they grounded the space shuttles and figured out what went wrong. There was an investigation 2 years after they launched the next one. Although they realized that maybe these space shuttles were not super duper safe. And so the space shuttles were completely retired in 2011. Most of these space shuttle missions were actually to go up to the space station. I think the space station is probably mankind's greatest achievement. Building a livable habitat in space is, I'm probably biased as an astronomy teacher, but I think it's incredible. It is definitely mankind's most expensive project. It's mankind's most technologically advanced project. A lot of the shuttle missions were to go up and put on new pieces of the International Space Station. So now that we're not using space shuttles, do we not get to go to the space station anymore? Actually, we still can go to the space station, but I'll get there in a second. So let's talk about the space station real quick. 1998 was the very first little piece of the space station that we took up and we put out in space. So we took out the first couple modules, hooked them together, threw on some solar panels, said, there we go. We started the space station, and that shuttle mission went back home. That's what it looked like. It was just two little modules hooked together. You can now dock, and you could go inside. It's not much to do because it's not very big. You got to start somewhere, and this was the first starting point for the space station. 5 years and a bunch of shuttle missions later, and the International Space Station is complete. You can see the very first two little modules are right here with those solar panels that were put on there. And now you have living quarters, you have a science wing, you have a little place where astronauts can eat, you have upgraded and extended solar panels. So to go from these two little modules to this entire space station in 5 years is quite impressive. Each one of these little modules has a name. Here's the first two. And my favorite one was actually built by Canada. It's called the Canadarm, because it's kind of a cool name. But it was built by a number of different countries: the United States, Japan, Russia, Canada, the United Kingdom, the European Space Agency, which has like France and Germany, which is why it's known as the International Space Station, not the United States Space Station. Every astronaut's favorite place is this little cubby hole. You can actually go down and look. It's almost like a 360-degree view as they're orbiting over the planet. You can look down, you can look around. It's kind of like a little cubby hole made out of windows. It's orbiting, which means it has to be going forward very fast. So it's going forward at about 17,000 miles an hour, which means it goes around planet Earth about every hour and a half. A couple of quick maths tells us that every day, every 24 hours, it goes around, it orbits Earth about 16 times. It's been in orbit since 1998, so about 8,400 days. It's been completely occupied by humans since the year 2000. It's gone around planet Earth about 122,000 times or so. And there have been almost 250 different astronauts that have spent time on the space station. The longest is Peggy Whitson, who spent almost 2 years. You can actually go to this cool website called How Many People Are in Space Right Now, and it will tell you who's in space, how many people are on the space station, who is there. Right now, it's Expedition 64, and there are 10 people on the space station. There's normally between 5 and 7. However, right now, there's a resupply mission that just brought up some new supplies, some new astronauts, and some of them have not left to come back home yet. So as I'm making this video, for the next couple days, there are 10. Here are the 10 astronauts who are up in space. And then over here, you can see all of the different countries that contributed to the space station. So what is NASA doing today? If we've made it to the moon, we finally beat Russia at something, what is NASA's goal today? Other than manned spaceflight, it's learning about space. What better way to do that than with Hubble? Hubble is probably NASA's most famous scientific instrument. It's probably the most famous scientific instrument to ever be made. It was launched on Discovery. We had to send up another shuttle crew to fix it. If you go from like when it was fixed to now, it's about 28 years that it's been working. Some cool photos that Hubble has taken. You can tell where the stars are because they're little plus signs. You guys already know that. This is called the Pillars of Creation. This is actually a giant cloud of gas where it is coalescing and new little baby stars are being formed. And what I think is really cool is that Hubble actually has a Twitter account. And Hubble will tweet out what scientist is currently using Hubble and what they are looking at with Hubble. After Hubble, we have James Webb. And we've talked about James Webb a little bit, but James Webb is that new telescope that hasn't been launched yet. It's been built, but hasn't been launched. We want to make sure that everything is going just perfect. It's the size of a tennis court. It's going to be out way past the moon. So if something goes wrong, like it did with Hubble, we cannot go up and fix it. It's just going to be a piece of space junk. It's huge. It's going to put Hubble to shame. It is way bigger, way better. You can see way farther, things that are much dimmer. The hard part is that you can't go fix it. It's also only going to have enough fuel on board to last about 10 years because you need to be able to turn these telescopes to look at different things. The only way to turn things in space is to have like a little gas canister that go psh, and it will turn. Once that gas runs out, you can't go refill it. Took longer than that to build, but in those 10 years, holy cow, are we going to get a lot of cool pictures. And it's going to launch in October of 2018. May of 2009. May of 2020. September of 2021. And that's pretty close. It's actually now October 31st of 2021. So Halloween. Fingers crossed. Maybe next year I won't have to change the date. I'll just be like, oh yeah, it's up in space. And here's a picture that it took. Again, just to reiterate, it's way bigger than Hubble. It's way better. I'm looking forward to it. Here is NASA's budget. I mentioned that it was much smaller than when we were going to the moon, but all of astrophysics, so all of we're learning about the universe, is in blue, and the James Webb Space Program, so that one telescope, is in green. Needless to say, this better work. Otherwise, it's going to be a huge waste of money.
Good morning, John. So in my last video, I was all to make a video about the James Webb Space Telescope. And then the nerdiest of the nerds in the comments were all, so today, I must talk about the James Webb Space Telescope because it's freaking awesome! But by way of a longer and second introduction to this topic, I have a thing to say. I personally believe that there are two ways to make the world a better place. You can decrease the suck, and you can increase the awesome. Now, these are not mutually exclusive things. That's hard to say, mutually exclusive. But they're also not the same thing. And it's clear that decreasing suck is extremely important, probably, in the end, more important than increasing awesome. And thus, when I talk about the space program, people are always like, NASA's money could be better spent on services for humanity. And to them I say, I do not want to live in a world where we only focus on suck and never think about awesome. If we lived in that world, then people would play soccer by having both teams stand and guard their own goal the whole game, with the ball sitting at midfield, and then at the end of the game we're supposed to all celebrate because no one scored any goals against our team. That's not gonna get you on SportsCenter. We have to guard the goal, and we have to try and prevent bad things from happening, but we also have to make good things happen. And that is why I love the James Webb Space Telescope. It's the Space Telescope version of a freaking awesome space telescope! So without further ado, my nerdy comrades, here are the top 5 reasons why the James Webb Space Telescope freaking kicks ass. It is huge! The total mirror size is 7.5 times larger than the Hubble Space Telescope's meter. The heat shield is the size of a tennis court. Number 4, it's a freaking transformer. Because it's so huge, it could never fit in its full form in the top of a rocket ship. And so in order to fit into the rocket, it's super duper folded up, and then when it arrives, it unfolds in like 12,000 different marvelous little ways that could go wrong at any moment, and it freaks me out because I worry about that. And oh, woe for humanity, no one is going to be there to see this thing open up. But luckily, the wonderful computer animators at NASA have given us the images that I have been showing you. Number 3, it will operate 1 million miles from Earth. That's about 4 times as far away from the Earth as the moon is. The Webb telescope actually orbits the sun. That's a simplification. It's actually in the relative stationary Sun-Earth Lagrange point 2. Which I'm not going to try to explain to you right now. If it screws up, there's no way to fix it. You may have noticed that we went to fix the Hubble like 10,000 different times. Well, we're not going to get that opportunity with the James Webb Space Telescope. One off. One chance to do it right. Or it's a $6 billion piece of space junk. That is tense. Number 2, it will be able to see planets orbiting stars in our galaxy. Individual planets. If the James Webb Space Telescope was 25 light years away, it could see the Earth. It can also determine the chemical composition of planets, and it can peer into stellar nurseries to see planets as they form. Watch solar systems forming. And finally, the James Webb Space Telescope can see 13.4 billion years into the past. This is particularly impressive because the universe is 13.7 billion years old. We will be seeing the first galaxies as they form, the first stars as they form. And guess what? None of this is necessary to life on Earth. None of it's going to help us cure malaria or install a democracy in Egypt, but it is awesome in the truest sense of the word awesome. I'm sorry that there's so many hand gestures in this video. I am feeling very gestury. This is the dawn of everything that we know. And that is increasing awesome. And that is something that I can get behind. John, I'll see you on Friday.
James Webb is not the only thing that NASA's doing, though. There's quite a bit of other stuff. So this was made back in 2015. You have TESS, which is the Transiting Exoplanet Sky Survey. We talked about that with exoplanets. That has been launched and is currently working. Poor little Kepler was working when this was made, but Chandra X-ray Observatory is still going. Hubble is still going. It's not just like 1 or 2 space telescopes. It's a whole bunch of space telescopes that NASA is working with. And almost all of them kind of report back to JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that's out in Pasadena, California. And if you watch The Big Bang Theory, That's where Sheldon works. And we're not just sending telescopes into space, we're also sending rovers and orbiters, a bunch of other flybys up into space. So here's a couple that we've mentioned this year, Voyager, Cassini, Pathfinder, and if you haven't been living under a rock, the Perseverance rover, which just landed on Mars with a helicopter. It has a space helicopter. So instead of going little tiny inch by inch, now we have a helicopter to just fly around Mars. So where are we? Well, New Horizons went by Pluto. We're definitely on Mars. We have Juno over by Jupiter. But the fun stuff is still us going into space. How do we, a United States astronaut, get into space? We don't have the space shuttle anymore. So we have to go over to Russia and use the Soyuz capsule that Russia has to get up into space. Elon with SpaceX is making it a little bit, maybe we can get back into space using a private company. SpaceX did launch 2 astronauts that made it to the space station and back, but that's just 2. Every other United States astronaut still has to go over to Russia in order to get into space. So of course, Russia is kind of beating us again. If you want to be an astronaut, the first thing that they ask you is, do you speak Russian? In order to be a United States astronaut, you have to speak Russian. All of their rockets are labeled in Russian. If you don't speak Russian, they're not going to let you on the rocket. So you have to be able to speak Russian because we have to go to Russia in order to get to the space station. As of now, Russia is the only country that is sending people to space. Except there's the hope that there's some private companies that are going to pick up the slack. So Blue Origin is one of them. I actually have a friend who works for Blue Origin, which is kind of cool. The United Launch Alliance is another private company. And then, of course, SpaceX. And they all actually rent out the launch pads from NASA. So this is a launch pad that NASA would use. And SpaceX has a big building right next to it that they are renting from NASA so that they can launch things into space. What is NASA doing to get back into space? We have the Orion program to get not only into space, but back to the moon and then to Mars. Maybe to Mars. Please to Mars. Right now it is going through tests. Obviously, testing takes a long time when you don't have a big budget and there's all kinds of red tape. But we've got the capsule pretty much designed. We've picked out some astronauts. And you can see that it is quite big when you compare it to an Apollo capsule. We have an Apollo capsule and then the Orion capsule. The Apollo capsule was very cramped with 3 people. The Orion capsule should be pretty spacious for 6 people. So here it is going through a water landing. So when it gets back to Earth from the moon, it has to land in the ocean. It needs to still be waterproof. And how are we going to get those Orion capsules up into space? We have the SLS, the Space Launch System. And you'll notice that below this line, every rocket is the same. And you can just make all of these rockets, mass produce them so that it's cheaper. And then depending on the mission, do you want to send people into space? Do you want to send cargo into space? Do you want to send people not very far? You don't need a whole lot of extra rocket fuel. Do you want to send people to Mars? Throw in a bunch of extra rocket fuel. So you're going to mass produce these. And then depending on the mission, you're going to change what the top of the rocket looks like. Is it astronauts or cargo? Is it short range, low Earth orbit, or is it to the moon or Mars? And here is a rendering of the Orion capsule on top of an SLS rocket. Hopefully, this will actually come to pass and happen soon. If you go to NASA's website, though, there are dozens and dozens of missions that NASA is currently doing right now today. And I want to leave you with this. Do you think sending people into space is worth it? With Apollo 1 and Challenger and Columbia, and the money that goes into space exploration, is that worth the knowledge and the exploration and the technology that comes with a space program? What do you guys think? Is human space exploration worth it? Yes or no? And why? They did the